So there we go. So basically, I would say, and a lot of other people on the call were there so they can collaborate. Mario, I'm glad you found your way here. I'm still catching up on emails, and I'll be happy to add you and Ben to the invite, and then you'll get a little bit more detailed information and can put it on your calendar, but I'm glad you found us. So yeah, the European Symposium was great. We had a really nice turnout for the workshop, which was, I don't know if surprise is the right word, but we were glad because there were two competing sessions that were also both really good. There was an oncology section and one on mind meat machine that was going to compare some of the LLM models for doing mapping and vocabulary matching. So we had good turnout, good discussion. We've got more people who are commenting on the proposal now. And so it looks like, we've got enough of a basis to keep moving forward. I will be using some of that time I blocked out tomorrow to go through the new comments. But the plan moving forward now is to share out the proposal with the other work groups that have that would be affected or would need to sign off on some of the things we're proposing because they cross over into their boundaries. So what I'm wanting to do in the next month is set up time for the Themis, the Common Data Model work group and the vocabulary work group to present the portions of the proposal that affect them most. And then once all the work groups have been sort of read into the proposal and had a chance to comment, I'm hoping sometime in June to schedule what I'm going to call a conclave. Because I feel like we have to make decisions. So a conclave in June with the stakeholders to basically vote on any points that everybody's not in agreement with. And I've talked to Anna about this some. I think we're going to go with majority rules. I think it'll be hard to get consensus on some of these. But the idea is to basically have a foundation that we can start using and then see what works and what doesn't work. So after the conclave, we've got the Connect survey data. Of course, anybody here working with data who wants to start applying the best practices is welcome to. But I want to be able to use Connect as a sort of demonstration project so we can see how the best practices work with the standard collection instrument type survey. Piper, I imagine you have some psychometrically validated instruments in mind that you would want to apply this to. And then after we've spent some time in the summer doing this, two things happen in the fall. One is the NCI Cohort Consortium. So this is a group of 30 or 40 other cohorts that collect data that includes oncology data, but basically share out what we've learned with them, see if they want to join in and map any of their data. And then at the Global Symposium, we've got another 4-hour workshop scheduled after the vocabulary workshop. So if there's crossover, people can attend both. And we'll use the first part of the workshop to go through the demonstration projects and share how it's done. And then the second part will be hands-on. So people can bring their own data and work on mapping, or we can provide some data for people to get some hands-on experience with it. And I think somewhere in there we'll have an evaluation point as to what's working and what's not, and then hopefully be able to present some results and finalize things at the European Symposium next year. So that's the plan. I think so far we're doing a pretty good job of staying on track for trying to get this done this year. I think how quickly things move forward in the summer, I think is largely going to depend on time available in the other work groups and when I can talk to them, and also get the conclave scheduled in June. So that's sort of the summary. Several of you were at the meeting as well. So if anybody else wants to share out their thoughts, you're welcome to.
Oh, okay. Nicole, I have a couple of questions, but maybe we can get to those a little bit later. I don't want to hijack the call.
Yeah. Oh, and I also pinged you. I know you went through the proposal in more detail on the flight home. I'm amazed you can work on a plane. I can't. um, but are you able to make our standard meeting time tomorrow? And I thought for your more
Yeah.
in-depth questions, we could go through
Yeah.
them then.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool. Right. Anyone else? Okay. Otherwise, Piper, you can go ahead and ask the ones that you think are good for this audience. And
all right.
like I said, we can dig deep later today.
Piper, sorry, one small question before you start. Nicole, so what was presented in Rotterdam? Is it the same proposal that we have in writing? Because
yes,
apologize, I haven't yet went.
Oops, I lost you, Alexander.
For me, it feels like that the text is very detailed and there is a lot of stuff. Oh, probably I'm interrupting, right?
I'm sorry, Alexander, you
But
keep
this is the same
breaking
one.
up. Yes, what was presented in Rotterdam was basically an outline version of the proposal. I can certainly share the slides in the wiki for anybody who wants to see them, but the content was the same. So nothing was discussed in Rotterdam that was different from what was in the proposal. Cool.
Yeah,
And
okay. So one of my questions, Nicole, is do we as a survey work group want to make sure that we're all sort of on the same page with the proposal? Because I know a couple of us had questions as we went through them. So do we want to, before we start to, bring it forward for voting or any of that, do we want to just clarify amongst ourselves what the proposal is and maybe just tighten it up a little bit?
Yeah, I definitely think we need to tighten it up. And so right now, and I was going to say, Alexander, if there are comments you want to make, please make them as soon as possible. Because yeah, what I would like to do between now and the next time we meet is go through the comments that have been added and kind of do some reworking. So like, I really liked what Anna was talking about with maybe trying to separate things out based on what affects which work group. So, because there are things in there that are, sort of themis conventions. There are things in there that relate to vocabulary. Of course, there are things that relate to us in the CDM. So I think it would be helpful to kind of compartmentalize what parts of the proposal are most under the umbrella of each work group. And then also answer those questions and things that have been put forth. So like one of the other discussions we had in the vocabulary session was whether we really want to include the metadata as yet another thing we add to the observation table, or if I haven't had a chance to look at it yet, or if we might be able to repurpose the survey table that they put forth for version 6 that was rolled back. But my understanding is that is largely a metadata table. And so we would have an extension table for doing the metadata. And I'm starting to really like that idea because I feel like it's easy to kind of overburden the observation table. So those are, so that's something I'm already thinking about revising based on feedback. But I think if everyone could get in their comments by by Friday, then that gives me a week to work with them. Piper and I can have some discussions. And then I think at the next work group meeting, we would go over, the core points. Obviously, it is a big document. So basically just going through over the actual principles and, and I think, in order to move this forward, I think we're going to have to go with sort of a majority rule position. That's also the plan for the conclave. And then basically try it out, beat it up, and then see what needs to change. But I think we could probably continue discussing this forever. And I think we need to kind of create a cutoff and then, work with what we've got and see how it goes.
Yeah. So, I think one of the things, it seems like based on the proposal, so there are a lot of things in there that are described as metadata, right?
Mhm.
That could be metadata, right? So here's the difference between what I see as metadata versus sort of a defining attribute of the concept. If you
Mhm.
look at laboratory tests, right? When we, in the measurement table, we put in a LOINC code, right?
Mhm.
And then a value. That LOINC code contains a lot of what we are calling metadata when we talk about these things in terms of
Can you give
assessments.
examples, like
Yep, so let me
what it
give you a
says? Yeah.
specific example. So when we talk about frequency, so we talk about pain, you're asking about pain over the last 2 weeks versus over the last month. And then we're talking about which instrument is used to measure that. So there's sort of, I think, two different approaches. We could say, hey, we're going to have a separate field that represents the time aspect, right? That this is the last, it's in 2 weeks, 1 week, 1 month. Or we could build that into the concept model. So for example, when we describe, we would have an observable entity in SNOMED, okay? And LOINC already builds this quote unquote metadata into their observable
Mhm.
that would say like frequency of pain in past 2 weeks or frequency of anxiety over last week. So you don't need separate fields in the table itself. We could just use the observation table. But what we would use to get that additional information are the defining attributes of that concept. So an analogy, like comparing this to like lab tests, it would be, we'll have a LOINC code for concentration of glucose in urine at a point in time, right? And all of that is built into the LOINC code. There's the time aspect. There is it's in the urine versus it's in blood. So I feel like the first decision that we need to make is, do we want our table, right? The information model or the table to capture those pieces of information in discrete fields, or do we build those into our observables? And does that make sense? Is it
makes
easier if I
sense,
show
yeah.
a picture or?
Yeah, what you're saying makes sense. I understand. And I think, Ben, I'll let you go first and then I'll reply. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Piper's question, I think. So one of the problems we're seeing in the measurement space is the fact just because you're specifying LOINC is not sufficient, right? Because some LOINC codes are sort of the parent code, which is just very generic, but some LOINC codes are actually very specific to not only the instrument, but the specific question being asked or the measurement being used, and it has all that like additional metadata like reference range and other things that are specific to that instrument and so on.
Yep.
The problem with converting that to like a SNOMED observation is that entities, including like CMS, are choosing the wrong LOINC code. They're not picking the specific LOINC code. They're picking the generic LOINC code, which does not have any of that specificity to it. And so it's happening, or they're rolling it up into a SNOMED observation, which has absolutely none of that in it. And it doesn't even identify the right instrument or the test or the, whatever the measurement is. And so I'm just worried from an operations perspective, if we don't provide some kind of Themis-like guidance about that particular practice, that everyone's doing it the wrong way in the documentation side, we're going to end up with a lot of muddy issues. I've been preaching about this whole issue for a long time, both to CMS and to the measurement community, because they're just doing it wrong. I mean, even in the Access program, they're going to measure outcomes, but they're using the wrong link codes because they say, well, HL7 Fire says for a questionnaire response and a questionnaire, you should use LOINC. I'm like, well, that's great. But like I said, each LOINC code is not necessarily specific enough. And so
Yeah.
We've been trying to use the logic in the measures and other things as artifacts to help with that, some of that metadata management or that using the right line code, but
Yep.
it's a real problem right now.
Yep. So
Yeah.
and you bring up 2 points, Ben. So one, do the codes exist to fully represent the thing you're trying to capture, right? That's one thing. Okay. And then are people mapping correctly, right? Are people encoding it correctly? So we
Right.
don't have any power over that, right? I mean, that's an implementation issue. The best we can do is provide guidance. I think the biggest point is, and I see pros and cons both ways, right? So again, it's always a trade-off. Do you represent the details of the meaning, right, of the question or the thing you're observing in the terminology, or do you use the vocabulary, or I'm sorry, or do you use, and so that's the vocabulary you
Right.
rely more heavily on the vocabulary, or do you rely on the information model, which is the table, right? So we would we'd have one field that says, here's the assessment instrument. We'd have a field that says, this is about pain, and we'd call out each of those features, the time aspect, separately. Okay. And again, it's where you represent it. When you look at LOINC codes, we don't, in the measurement table, we don't have a separate field for, here's the component we're measuring, it's glucose. Here's where we're measuring it. We're measuring it in blood. We're measuring it in Europe. Here's what we're measuring. We're measuring the concentration, or we're measuring the volume, or whatever. The LOINC code encapsulates all that meaning, right? So I'll give you an example. This is the extreme version of allowing the terminology to represent the meaning. We would have something, in fact, let me show a picture of this because I think it's clear if we see it. And what I'll do is I'm first going to show an example of, in the LOINC ontology, which is, okay, here we go. LOINC ontology, LOINC.SNOMED. All right. Let's see, glucose concentration. Glucose.
So while you're pulling up, I just want to say I'm very much in favor of the information model side of that equation, because again,
okay,
I don't believe the ontology should be the thing. The ontology, the clinical ontology of the clinical data vocabulary concept code should not be the thing that is providing that level of information, right? Because but I think my perspective is when we're talking about taking the codes that are being mapped into the Odyssey OMOP vocabulary, because we use an internal vocabulary, that we really do provide either very detailed mapping instructions, or we only actually include as standard codes those particular components of the ontology that are specific enough to do what we're trying to do, that'll fit into that information model, which is that measurement table.
Okay. Okay.
And I just wanted to chime in saying, I definitely agree with, there's a limit to what we want to load and into the meaning of the LOINC code. And I do like the idea of having, like I said, a separate metadata, and I think you've already said this, Piper, where we're, the name of the survey, the type of the survey, how it's administered, all those other things you might need to interpret or know if you can pull your data with another survey and another table. But like your example with how you felt over 2 weeks, to me is like, that's the question level. That's being mapped as a concept, at the question level. And I think we can give some, detail on mapping. I think the thing we have to be careful about is over specifying, because, people are going to have different situations based on whether or not it's a standard collection instrument or a validated instrument, things like that.
Yeah. Okay. So I feel like we're talking about a lot of different things all at once. So, so first I'll show this. We have a LOINC code, right? And so this is the LOINC codes put into, I don't know if folks are familiar, this is the LOINC ontology where essentially the LOINC codes are going into SNOMED and using the SNOMED concept model because you get the benefit of using sort of the ontology here. But again, so there is a LOINC code. So this LOINC code right here, 6.3, blah, blah, blah. In our measurement table, okay, so this LOINC code is for the presence of ketone body in urine at a point in time by test strip, okay? So you look here, what the property is the presence, right? And the technique is the test strip technique. The component, the thing we're measuring is the ketone body, and we're looking at it at a single point in time. What I personally like about the way we do measurement and lab measurement is it's very clean. I mean, you have a LOINC code and you can, when you do your analysis, you can leverage all of these things. You can say, hey, show me all tests where we were looking at ketone bodies and show me all tests where we were looking just at a single point in time, right? You use these features. And now I think when we talk about this around assessment instruments, we're using the language of metadata. Well, is it really metadata? Is it really data about this test, or are really these the intrinsic properties of what we're measuring? So, like, if let's use an analogy. Yeah, hang on 1 second. Wait, Nicole, let me just finish my thought, okay? Because I'm not saying this is the right way to go, but I think we want to present this just because SNOMED and LOINC, the vocabularies are doing a lot of work around this, right? So our decision at the Odyssey level has to take into account, it's like we're building a phone and we're using components, right? And the components, Odyssey's the phone. It's the thing that we're using to navigate the world, right? Collect information. But at the end of the day, it has components, and vocabulary is a really huge, important component in this device that we're creating for analytics. So we need to be aligned with the device. So the only point, and again, I'm not arguing one way or another because I see benefits of doing it both ways. I just want us, as we make this decision as a community, I want us to make this decision based on, full information. And I want us to look at two options and look at the pros and cons. So a way of representing a question in an assessment instrument would be something like, presence of sadness, right? Or presence of sadness over the past 2 weeks by PHQ-9, right? So you would have a separate, you'd capture all of that detail in your concept. That has implications for how you do your analytics. Okay.
Piper, so definitely agree that is very important, right? But we are not even close to talking through what the decision is going to be, right? Because now we are in the terminology type of debate, whether it's going to be, whether we're going to call it metadata or not. In Odyssey, we never call this metadata because this is obviously the content. This is part of the content because this is part of the concept. And you're right. So it's either defining attributes or whatever other way you want to call it, but this is part of the concept and part of the content. Once you have it in the LOINC concept or whatever other concept, this is given, right? So you can just get rid of it because it's already in there. And whatever you use this concept, you're assuming that this piece of information is encoded into this concept. And this is what this concept means, right? So we can't just say that we don't care about some of these attributes and then we're going to ignore them. So this is not going to work. And
okay. So
Yeah,
you're
let's-
saying,
Right. So-
Alexander, you're saying, hey, but the thing is, we don't have this in our terminology. And so essentially we can't rely on a SNOMED code or a LOINC code because they don't have the information we need in those codes. Is that what you're saying?
Well, we haven't yet looked at the survey codes, right? They have something. The question
Yep.
is whether that is sufficient or not.
Yes. So, yep. So I think
And
that's,
then, you know,
and
and then
that's
if
what,
it's,
go ahead.
oh, I was gonna say, and I think that's part of the process, right? If it's not sufficient, then that's when we're looking at, can we add this as a vocabulary?
Okay.
I think maybe part of the root of this problem is the terminology of calling attributes that are part of the question level, or your example, the lab test label, metadata. Maybe we need to not call that metadata in the proposal, because what I'm thinking of as metadata are the attributes about the survey itself, not at the
Yes.
question level.
At the question level.
Yeah, because at the question level, we are specifying those pieces that you laid out. So I think we need
Yes.
to maybe not call that metadata. Maybe, Alexander, we were saying, it's part of the what we're defining with the vocabulary and with the LOINC code, and determining, what's the generic level versus what Ben was talking about is this detailed enough? And if it's not,
Yes.
do you need to consider going through the vocabulary pipeline and getting a detailed enough version? And I'm sorry, Ben, I cut in line. But
That's fine.
Go ahead, Ben.
That's your
Sorry.
prerogative as the chair of this group, right? But no, I want to go back because the PHQ-9 was brought up, and that's the place I have been focusing almost all of my energies lately.
Okay.
And this is very important again, because at the LOINC level, and this is, you can do this for this instrument, but probably not for some of the other instruments like Promise. But it is the parent code for PHQ-9 Quick Depression Assessment panel, which just means reported, right? There's a LOINC code for every individual item question on that, which is for standardized questions, which you can then, you can assign the question to a value, the score, right? There's also one for the total score reported, which means you have a completion of a PHQ-9 questionnaire. And why I'm bringing that up is because in the depression screening measure and the depression follow-up remission response to treatment measure, where we use the PROM of PHQ-9, it relies wholly on the total score LOINC code for 4261-6. However, there are also options for suicidality screening where you're using not only the PHQ-9 total score, but you're also using the questions 8 or 9 of that and positive response to those, again, to identify for suicidality screening. Only if you're using those codes correctly, because again, those are very standardized questions. So when we went to develop the unhealthy alcohol use screening measure, and there's the audit, but that was, we weren't finding any of those audit screening questions in the coding vocabulary level. We deployed LLM NLP in several different EHR instances, and we were able to find the questions highly standardized in clinical notes. And so we actually requested a new LOINC code to represent that specific question, just as a single item screener, that represented that question being asked, and that should be paired with it, like as a name value pairing as a response, like a value. So when we're thinking about metadata, are we thinking about metadata in terms of the words in these questions? So we're trying to capture, like, what is this question trying to address? Which is already kind of there. It's just, it's not perhaps,
And so
visible, right?
Yeah. So, and I would argue that's not metadata. When you say, what is the question trying to address?
I would also argue that too.
Suicide, right? You're
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
we need, if that's the way, if it's phrased like that in the proposal, then that needs to shift, because it is information about the question. The only thing I have a question about, again, in terms of any concerns about over-specifying, is if the aspects or qualities of the question, so what you have broken out in this table, does it have to include the instrument as opposed to having the
Yes.
instrument in the actual metadata? And the only reason I'm asking that is there's a very specific question level, but on something, as opposed to psychometrically validated instrument, a similar question could be asked on a standardized, collection instrument, and we could use the same code, but it's from a non-psychometrically validated. So do we want it, obviously to some point this has already been done, but do we want to include the instrument it comes from as part of that question level? Or is that really
Yes.
where we draw a
It's-
line and move it? Okay,
I think
so
it's
and the
critically important that
reasoning,
that you're able to attribute a specific question that is part of a psychometrically validated questionnaire, that you can attribute that to a particular instrument.
Yes.
Whether or not, if you're asking it, off the cuff, or whether it's, you're asking as part of that instrument, I think it's critically important to somehow be able to trace that back to that particular instrument that question is part of, right?
Mhm.
So the other piece of, when you're talking about metadata for these questions, so I think the metadata components are actually in the response value. Like, what are the possible response values for that? And along with, like, what instrument does this question belong to? Like, those are the two pieces of metadata, I think, for these questions really are the most important pieces that have to be dealt with.
Ben, wait a minute. So I think there are two definitions, right? One is when you look at the source level and the model that is used by the specific survey instrument, and then something could be part of metadata or data. And then there is a OMAP type of thing, right? The representation we have after we put the information into the content, which is vocabulary, and the data model of common data model.
Right.
So again, it might be tricky because the same thing could be the data and metadata at the same time. So LOINC answers might be called the metadata when you look at the model of LOINC. But when it sits in OMAP, it's not the metadata because that is a value concept ID, which is a concept ID, which is part of the content. So we need to actually agree on the terminology before we are into these debates.
I'm not talking about the answer itself. I'm talking about the reference range. What is the range of potential answers? That is the metadata piece. The answer itself is not metadata.
Okay,
right?
so Ben,
The reason these two things are so important is if we're talking about tracking depression symptoms, if we're talking about tracking pain or function, you need to make sure you're using the same question from the same questionnaire across those various instances of that administration. That's why it's so important to have that metadata, because from a data quality perspective, you need to be able to track those things.
So Ben,
Ben, that would be a metadata only if it's modeled as a as a metadata. If you have this from 1 to 10 being part of the name of the concept itself, it's not going to be the metadata, right? So again, it could be modeled.
It's definitional, right? So again, think about what you have a question. In my mind, a defining attribute, so of a question, and I'll tell you, LOINC is doing this. LOINC is creating, so they're reconceiving their assessment model. Currently, they assign a LOINC code to the question. They have a code for the answer list. So Ben, that speaks to your question of, well, hey, I have this same question, but in this survey, they answered it using a 5-point Likert scale, right? And in this survey, they answered it using a 7-point Likert scale. So what LOINC is doing, and they don't currently, they're creating a separate LOINC code that represents, so there's one LOINC code for the question, there's a code for the answer list, and then the answers within it. And then there's another code that represents the binding of this question to this answer list. Okay.
Right.
So think of here's what I think we need to start, at least for psychometric instruments. The answer list is not just metadata answer list, right? It is the method by which you are obtaining a response. So I would say, if you look at, like, you have a question and then you have the method, it has a response scale. It might be a Likert 5, it might be a Likert 3, it might be an ordinal scale, right? And then it has the thing that it's measuring, right? Is this a Likert scale? is this measuring frequency? Is this measuring severity, magnitude, right? There's sort of the response scale itself has its own focus or construct, right? Just like the question. Now, so as we've been going through this, let's see, you know, I feel like we need to sort of play with it now before we even propose it, because what I've been doing is I've actually been going through our data, right? And I'm looking at where we have LOINC codes, where we don't, where we have answer lists. And what you'll see is there are certain patterns that we're going to need to find solutions to. For example, we might have a question that says, what was your severity of pain? And your answer list is mild, moderate, severe. Well, then we have another question that says, what's your severity of pain? And the answer list is mild pain, moderate pain, severe pain, right? So I don't think when the concept that we're measuring is redundant, right, within the answer list, we need a way of essentially normalizing that, right? So that the answer list is mild, moderate, severe, even though you're repeating mild, mild pain, moderate pain, severe pain, mild fatigue, moderate fatigue, severe fatigue, right? Mild nausea, we need to think about that. I think that we need to step back. I know we're wanting to take a proposal and move forward with it. I don't think that the entire, even this survey group or the stakeholders who are most knowledgeable about Odyssey and vocabulary and all of that stuff, I'm not sure that all stakeholders have fully contributed to this proposal. I think the proposal, Nicole, I know we put it together from a lot of discussions we've had, and but I think we need to maybe take a step back and identify sort of what are the next steps that we as a group need to take in order to come up with a solid proposal, right? And maybe that's two different options.
So, yeah, I mean, I guess some of the things I feel like you're talking about are things that are decisions that are made by the person doing the mapping. Like, I don't know that we prescribe that moderate pain is the same as moderate generic answer. I think that's something I think two things. One, we have to be really careful about over specifying. And because, I think some things we're going to learn by other people getting out there and following, the basic recommendations and seeing what the issues are.
But I don't know that we have recommendations yet, right? I mean, or are our recommendations
recommending at a high level? We're not recommending at the level you're going down to. These are higher level, are you doing triplets? What tables are you putting things in? Higher level type recommendations, because it's going to be really hard to specify for all the different permutations within the psychometrically validated instrument versus permutations that are in the standard collection instruments. And so it's basically putting out some high level, this is how you start tackling it. Let's tackle it. And then let's see what the issues are. And then what things do individuals figure out, have to make the decisions themselves in the mapping process. And then what things can be recommendations. But I think if we're going to try to specify at the level you're talking about, we're basically trying to map everything for everybody all at once, and that's not doable. And I think we have to, if after we talk later and I look at some of the other comments people have had, we have been talking about this for 2 years. We could easily talk about this for another 2 years. At some point, it's just taking what are the big picture things we can move forward and then see how that works and get feedback beyond this group.
I think, again, I don't mean to be a naysayer and negative. I just, as somebody that's, kind of been working with this content for a really long time, I know that there are two really important pieces that need to be in place in order for us to be able to represent assessment or survey data well. And one, we need to have the content and standard vocabulary. And we already know, right, that we're missing, LOINC is missing more than, you know, the analysis we did at our health system was 70% of the content we had for standard surveys weren't even in LOINC, right? So we're missing the concepts. We need to figure out, you know, how, you know, do we wait for the standards organizations to get their terminology complete? I don't think we can, right?
No.
Okay, but I think at minimum we need to make a decision about what are we going to allow the terminology to manage, right? And what are we going to use the information model or the CDM to manage? What you're talking about, because I feel like what we're proposing is inconsistent, because we're saying use the observation table, not a dedicated assessment table, right? So we're saying, and when we say use the observation or measurement table, the only way that works is if all of the pertinent information is encapsulated in the vocabulary. And again, I'm going back to the measurement table and lab tests. So let's think of that. You know, we don't have a separate field for, we're measuring glucose, we're measuring it in urine, we're measuring it in the last, at a point in time or over a 24-hour collection period. The terminology encapsulates all of that. It encapsulates the time aspect, which is something we're talking about for assessments, right? It encapsulates the thing we're measuring, glucose, ketones, whatever, right? The analogous thing on the assessment side is the thing we're measuring: pain, fatigue, family history, you know, blah, 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 the component. So the vocabulary encapsulates that. If we think that we're unlikely to be able to use the vocabulary to represent those things, then we need to be proposing a survey table that has fields for those things, right? And as you're saying, you're calling them metadata, right? So then we would have, our table would say, this is the instrument it comes from. This is the scale it comes from, right? This is the time aspect. But then we have to keep in mind that has to work with the terminology we have. Because if we're not going to use LOINC codes, then we're going to have to create all new concepts outside of LOINC. And then, okay, so you have a LOINC code that says little interest or pleasure in doing things in the last 2 weeks. That LOINC code encapsulates 2 weeks.
Right.
What it does. Okay, so then do you know what I'm saying?
I think so, but I think, yeah, to me, the time portion is part of the question, whereas the other information you mentioned describes the instrument itself.
Yes.
And maybe an instrument is always going to have every question at 2 weeks. I don't know. And if that's the case, but if it doesn't, then that 2 weeks is part of the question. And, you know, then we're looking at another concept ID to describe a question that is a point in time or 4 weeks or a year or whatever, that, you know, that would require a separate concept ID. And we know going into this, we do not have an extensive enough vocabulary to cover what's in these instruments. But by virtue of starting to do the mapping, then, you know, part of that process is, you know, I need A, B, C, X, Y, and Z. And then here's the vocabulary pipeline. And so, you know, the first stops are LOINC and SNOMED. And if that doesn't fit into their plan or their timeline, then it goes to the vocabulary group to be added. And, you know, what we really want to try to get away with, and by, again, trying to offer these higher level sort of principles, is to get people mapping so that they can request these vocabularies so that we can get them added through sort of a workflow, as opposed to all the siloed work that's been being done. And so so I think we're, things are not all going to align the way we would like, but I think by moving forward and having more people working on the mapping and trying to, follow, general principles, we can start putting forth the vocabulary that's needed and, the more and other specifications. But I just don't want to over specify before we start. And we also start knowing that vocabulary is going to be lacking until it gets requested.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, I struggle with the mapping thing, right? Are we, okay. So to me, I mean, let's just step back and think about questions, and maybe we need to talk about these things individually, right? Maybe we want to talk about, okay, how do we represent questions? And that's a big piece, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is the thing that we're observing, right? Pain, nausea, fatigue, family history, past experience, whatever. There's the thing we're observing, and then there's the value of what we're observing. So I would say one of the, I don't know if you have it, are you able to share the proposal?
Yeah, the link should be in the chat, but if we've
Okay,
got
I was just
going to
put,
chat, I can share the
here,
link again.
I annotated my document, so I didn't want to pull it up. So one specific question, and so maybe we can take these as specific action items. So what we have is we have the observation concept ID and the observation value as concept ID. Right now, the proposal says the observation concept ID is going to represent the clinical meaning of the question, right? And then the value ID is going to represent the clinical meaning of the value.
So can I ask a question on that though? I mean, and this is semantic level, like, why are we calling these observations when they're actually measurements? I mean, this is one of the main areas
yep.
that I think is causing issues, right? That's the perception issue, if you will. And I don't mean to be snarky about this. I'm just kind of posing the question.
So you know what, Ben, I think you're right for psychometrically validated assessment instruments. But wait, hang on one second. Sorry to overtalk, Alexander. So there is, when we were talking about reference ranges like high and low, I mean, for psychometrically validated assessment instruments, if you're using a Likert scale that assumes a ratio, which means, there's an absolute zero and, values between, it does seem that the measurement table would be more appropriate. And the advantage of that is you could use sort of that, I don't know about the reference rate, but let's, I think, step back a second. I think we need to talk about each of these components separately. Otherwise, we're going to keep doing what we're doing, which is going around and around. Let's talk about the question and the answer, because one of our huge use cases is we have a question, we have an answer, but we need to understand what we need. Ultimately, at the end of the day, our goal is to understand the clinical meaning of that combination of question and answer, right?
Right.
So, okay.
And that's where I keep getting hung up on, because
so
again,
I think
even at the question answer level, those are still measurements, right? The clinical finding that is the result of that question and answer scenario.
Okay. So
sorry,
okay.
There's problem.
Go ahead, Alex.
Can I answer, because we're going in circles, right? So there are historical reasons why these are not the measurements but observation. And the main reason is that there is a mass we can't really put into the measurement table. And there is no any additional value rather than having these debates and winning these debates.
I think, Alexander, the problem is from a clinical perspective, if you're talking about something that is actually an observation, that is a clinical interpretation of something, or that is an interpretation of something, right? That's the traditional standard definition in the clinical documentation community, right? When you're talking about, whether you're talking about a psychometric instrument or you're talking about a question in response to a survey, those are still technically measurements because they don't actually generate on their own a clinical finding. There's other information from the information model that has to be applied to that particular pairing that then generates the actual observation itself. And so I know that
But I
historically
totally
that's a
agree.
complete
So
mess,
it makes
but that's,
total
but
sense.
we're talking sort of like moving forward and providing guidance about how these things should be managed going forward so that people can do it better. And we will have to deal with a historical perspective, you know.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. But
So
in
Ben,
the future, we need to define what is what and what has this privilege to be the measurement or not, or being put in this into a separate table and so on and so forth. But as it is now, because we simply can't really put the psychometric and all the sort of like validated type of things in one bucket and the rest in another. There is no way at the moment. It's one big mess sitting in the OMA vocabulary. So we just don't have a good way to sort it out.
so
Well-
Alexander, before you know, if we put aside the observation versus measurement thing, let's start with what we know. Like, let's start with the question, right? The individual observation itself. Okay, because we have a way of dealing with score, and that's a separate issue for psychometrically validated assessments. Let's start by focusing on the question. At the end of the day, there is something that we're observing, right? And then there's the value of that observation. So if you think about how our guidance for populating the observation table, let's start with a really simple question like, what language do you speak, right? What's your primary language? We have a clinical finding of speaks English, speaks Spanish, speaks German, blah, blah, blah. We don't populate the observation table, right, with the finding. The OMOP guidance is there's the thing that we're observing, and that goes in the observation concept ID, and there's the value of what we're observing, and that goes in the observation value. We say language spoken is the thing we're observing, and then we put in the value. And Nicole, this goes to the we are post coordinating, we are not pre-coordinating, we are keeping, and that's essential. That's essential for pooling data, right? So what we're observing, so I think for every question answer pair, and this is for every question answer pair, we need to step back and we want to say, we don't want to look at the question independently and the answer list independently. We want to look at the combination of the question and the answers and say, hey, what are we observing? Let me give you an example. We have a question, pain, and the answer list is mild, moderate, severe, right? We have a question, pain, and the answer list is once a week, once a month, you know, never. So so clearly we're using the same word, or how is your pain, or what is your pain, okay? And we're observing two different things. So our observation has to always be you know, what is the property we're measuring of something? Frequency of pain, much like we do with lab tests. Frequency of pain, severity of pain, right? Frequency of nausea, severity of nausea, type of pain, location of pain, whatever it is, right? So I think that was the one thing I disagreed with in our table, where we said the observation concept idea is the concept that represents the question, right?
Well, we were talking about how, so part of it is, you know, there's what Ben was talking about with like the clinical ideas or how these are defined clinically, but we're also trying to incorporate these into the Odyssey model. And so, you know, and we've also talked about the importance of being able to look at the question answer pairs, but also, like we said, doing this as a post coordinated thing. And so you know, when I think of like what is the fact or the value that comes from that question answer pair, that's what ends up in the condition table or the measurement table, or whatever. And the observation, we're basically recording how we got there, that question answer pair.
Can you say
And
that again,
then,
Nicole? The
yeah,
fact
so
goes, okay, go ahead.
so your fact then is that clinical meeting, and that's the piece that would go into the measurement table or the condition table.
So you're saying like, okay, so for example, we have the observable pain, severity of pain, severe pain. That you're saying that would go in our observation, but then we would also add to the condition table the finding of severe pain.
Correct.
Okay,
Because
and see,
sometimes
I
it's going to be
wonder
built
about that.
into the, sometimes it'll be built into the answer. Like they're both the same, right? The finding of pain, and it's in the question answer pair is pain, and then the condition table is pain. But sometimes it's something that's more derived. It's not as obvious, you know,
Right.
a one-to-one
So-
match between what the answer is and what you put in the condition or the measurement table.
Okay, so I wonder about that. I wonder about that. And I wonder if that's the case for all questions, because think about this. When we record lab tests, we'll say blood pressure, and it is what it is. We don't then also add a record that says elevated blood pressure, low blood pressure, right? Same with language. We have this observation, language spoken, Spanish. We don't then add the meaning of that combination of what is essentially a thing we're observing and the value, and then say, oh, and they speak Spanish. It's kind of redundant information,
It is,
right?
it can be redundant. And that's, you know, and that was one of the, you know, the concerns that Anik had as well. Part of the reason for doing that, though, is making sure the information is in the right place for use. So the observation table is sort of making sure we can maintain our question answer pairs so we know how something was derived. Putting the finding or the fact or value, whatever you want to call it, into the condition or measurement table, though, is where people search when they're actually looking to do, you know, create a cohort or a phenotype or a diagnosis or pull with EHR data. So it's basically, you know, being able to maintain a record of what our question answer pair is, and then having the finding that's used the way findings are conventionally used within the OMOP model.
Yeah, and I think about
So
that in the context of like, I don't think the value belongs in the condition of the observation table, but I do think that the process of post coordination generates that condition or that finding, right? The value itself is probably stuck in the measurement side, because that's what I always think of value as an actual like value. It's either an answer or it's a value or it's a numeric, whatever it is. That's the quantification of that particular question, if you want it, right? But it does come out of post coordination, like this idea of, you know, the post coordination that happens, that is either clinical reasoning or it's the logic that's applied to those particular values in those other tables that generates that condition or that finding or that observation. And maybe that's overly simplistic, but that's kind of how I think about it in terms of how I separate those two things, because we have a problem of a lot of pre-coordination happening at the data element level, which causes also all kinds of problems, which is kind of why we're ending up in this conversation now. And so we maybe, like I said, maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but I just think that's
but I think we have to start simple before we can get more complex, right? And so, yeah, I think that makes sense. We are at time, and for those of us who are going on the community call, that's starting now. We'll get these minutes of the discussion posted. Piper, you and I will talk again later, and then we'll sort of recap at the next meeting where we are on the proposal, and then what things will be updated based on these conversations and the comments and conversations since the European proposal, and then go from there. So thank you, everybody. It's been a great discussion, and have a great rest of your week. Bye.
Thanks, Nicole.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Alexander.
Thank you all.